Welcome to Season 4 of the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we discuss business agility through customer experience, employee experience, and digital transformation. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at gregkihlstrom.com and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile Brand podcast. Today we're going to talk about how to ensure your organization takes a structured approach to providing a consistently great customer experience through CX governance. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Wendy Pravda, Principal Customer Experience Advisor at Medallia. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Greg. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this with you. So why don't we start by you giving a little background on yourself as well as what you're currently doing at Medallia?
Sure. I got my start working in UX, actually in user experience in relation to digital products over 20 years ago. And then about 11 years ago, my company that I was at needed some CX work. So I decided to use that UX background to establish a strong foundation in CX, since there's some shared principles between the two. I've worked for companies such as Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and a subsidiary of United Healthcare prior to joining Medallia last year. And in my current role, I guide clients through establishing, maintaining, and growing their CX program and strategy. And governance for me is a topic I love, since I see how much it helps organizations move the needle.
Great. Well, yeah, let's dive in then. And so let's start by making sure that everybody knows what we mean by CX governance. So why don't you start by defining that, and why is CX governance so important?
Okay, so governance is the process that guides the company or the organization to identify the accountabilities across specific teams and individuals, and it also enables effective decision-making. It's a critical component of change management, and it ensures that something happens with all of the information you receive from your CX program. There are three main models for governance generally that we talk about: centralized, decentralized, and hybrid models. And those are the three that in general companies use when talking about governance.
Great. So as far as timing and sequencing goes, when is the best time to define governance for an organization?
The best time is when you begin your CX program and you're working on that change management component that I mentioned.
Yeah.
It's best to start thinking about it and defining it, up front with your strategy. However, if you didn't do this up front, it isn't too late. You can always do it later if you realize you have gaps and you need to establish governance.
So for those organizations that might have some gaps, what are some of the signs that they need some better governance or they might need some better governance?
Yeah. So if you're seeing confusion with your team structure, with accountabilities, roles and responsibilities, those are things I hear often. Also, if you're not seeing inner and outer loop closure occurring as you should, we talk about inner and outer loop closure with clients a lot. With proper governance, it's hard to close the loop effectively on the feedback coming in. If you don't have, that proper governance, you can't do that well. So you need to ask yourself, is everyone clear on what they're supposed to do? Do we have defined meetings with a purpose and cadence? Are we solving customers' needs based on the feedback we're getting? And if you can't say yes to all of those, then you need to look into governance. And I can't stress enough how important governance is.
So can you actually elaborate a little bit? You mentioned inner outer loop. Can you, for those that might not be as familiar with that?
Yes. So your inner loop is when you're closing the things that happen on a daily basis. Let's say in your field, right? You have things coming in. And so you're closing that loop with the feedback that you're getting, regularly. Yeah. The outer loop is going to be the bigger themes or bigger topics that you're seeing coming in from multiple people. So on an, aggregate basis. And those are things that you'll end up needing executive buy-in on. You're going to probably need cross collaboration with teams to determine which of those issues you fix first. But you need to be looking at both of those, right? So there's the closing of the inner loop and the closing of the outer loop. And that governance is going to help get you both.
Great. So you mentioned earlier about there being three different main models of CX governance. So decentralized, centralized, and hybrid. Can you talk a little bit about each of those a bit more and point out if any of these models generally work better than others?
Yes. Okay. So centralized is when you have one CX organization with one central leader. So picture, one leader at the top, and there's strong corporate authority there. There's support from champions and key functions. And I've really found that this model works best for smaller organizations. It could work for larger companies, but this is really a model where you have that central leadership. So, that means it's going to be more autocratic in nature.
Got it.
Okay, decentralized is different. In that model, the CX program owners are in each business unit. So think of multiple executives. So they're independent CX teams and each department has autonomy. So that would work well in an organization that has multiple executive leaders or different sorts of businesses. And then lastly, hybrid, and this is the one by far that we recommend the most. It works well for a lot of companies. It's a blend really of the two. So there's a central advisory and governance with localized accountability. So you have a CX team and councils that meet regularly. So those councils are made up of different people in the organization that meet, but you also have that CX team. So the corporate, centralized corporate team focuses on methodology, systems, and best practices. And then the execution is done in the business units. So it's a little bit of, best of both worlds, and it can work for small or large organizations equally well.
So in that hybrid model, then what are the kinds of roles and maybe even departments that are sitting in those groups?
So let me give you an example. In one of my previous companies, how it was set up, it was a hybrid model.
Yeah.
We had a global organization, and that global organization looked at things like best practices. They managed the main contract with the vendors. And they looked at it globally. So they had APAC, they had EMEA, they had the US, they had Canada, they had Mexico, they had everything. Then you had the localized people, so CX positions that were in each region. So let's just say the US, for instance, had a CX team of their own, and there were councils that would meet between sales, between customer service, between marketing. So you had multiple teams that impact CX, and those councils would meet together. There were also councils that would meet for all of the regions up into global. So there's a lot of, cross-pollination and cross-learning, but the execution work is being done in those local areas.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense because, I often say, to an extent, CX is everybody's job.
Yes, it
is. So that kind of balances there still is governance because, I completely agree with you on, governance is definitely needed, but it allows for all of the different roles, sales, marketing, IT, all of those different roles that need to sit around.
Exactly. So you want to get those people involved, and those council meetings and hybrid model help allow for that. Not that the other ones don't, but we just find that hybrid model really allows for those councils to get together and that cross collaboration.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about measurement. So I think there's two ways of looking at measurement. One is the CX metrics. So, how are customers, are they satisfied? Are they buying more? All of that. But, to talk a little more internally, how do you measure that your CX governance is working with more of an internal and an operational measure?
Yeah, so that is an interesting question. I would say, if your governance is working, if you have a clear team structure, cadence, you understand the roles and responsibilities, and that's all established and working. And also, like I said before, if your inner and outer loop are being closed successfully. So there isn't a specific metric just for governance, but you're going to know if there are gaps, and you can, at least metrics wise, look at your loop closure metrics.
Yeah, that makes sense because it's also because it's hybrid and somewhat decentralized. It's the reporting structure isn't centralized, so I would imagine it can become challenging based on some of the normal metrics that you might, you and your boss have a certain set of metrics that are used to to measure your success, but when you're working cross enterprise, it's a little bit different.
Yeah. And, the thing is that governance means so much, right? It's all these different practices that come into play. And a lot of it does have to do with the structure, right? Making sure that everyone understands their roles, that everything is being accomplished as it should, and thus then your inner and outer loop are going to get closed. So that's why I say it's a little hard to find a specific metric for governance, but you will know. You will know if you're, if things are going well, and if everyone understands what they're doing, and if things are being closed and done successfully for the customer.
Well, and what about improving? So it's one part of it is ensuring that you're being successful. We're here on the Agile Brand podcast, so this is a bit of a leading question, but what about that? The systems of continuous improvement, and are those working groups or those that hybrid model? Are they responsible for continuous improvement as well? Like, how would you handle that?
Yes. So, if you are looking at what you're doing well or what you're not doing well, especially in those council meetings or in your CX function, you should always be looking for that continuous improvement. It's a loop that you go through even with governance, right? You're going to continually assess how are we doing and how do we do things better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one last question before we wrap up. For those that are wanting to get started, they've identified a need to improve CX governance, but not really sure where to begin. What's your advice for them as far as getting started?
I would say the first thing is getting that executive or leadership buy-in. Without this, it will be hard to push forward any governance structure that people will stick to. I've seen plenty of organizations that might start with something, but they don't get that buy-in, so it dies on the vine. We don't want that. Yeah. Outside of this, start with identifying your gaps and work with your team to set up something that works for your company and your structure. Only you know what will work for your company. Make sure that you do some sort of RACI chart or something similar that outlines what each role is going to be doing so that there's no confusion. Make sure that you actually talk to your team about that and that everyone's clear on it. There's so many things. I'd say those are the first few. And governance can be challenging, but it also helps move the needle on CX, and it's really rewarding once you have it established.
Yeah. Well, just to follow up on your first point about leadership, I totally agree with all of your points, but I think the leadership thing, that's certainly something that it really kind of is the starting point for things. If you don't have that, it's foundational. So, what would your advice be to someone with, let's say the leader is on board slightly but skeptical? How do you move the needle there? What would your advice be to someone to try to move the needle there?
I think that actually having a meeting with that executive or executive team or leadership team and highlighting a few things. You want to highlight the benefits that they'll realize from it. A lot of times you can look at ROI. You can work with your financial teams on that, or whatever teams you have internally. ROI usually tends to work well with them. Additionally, coming with some sort of proposal in terms of how the governance would work and why that's going to be beneficial. If you already also have some inner or outer loop closure metrics, or you don't have those metrics, let's say at all, because it's not happening, that's something that you'll want to talk to the executive team about as well.
Well, Wendy, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, and feel free to message me there if you'd like.
Great. Well, again, I'd like to thank Wendy Pravda, Principal Customer Experience Advisor at Medallia, for joining the show. Thanks for listening to The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom. Talk with you next week. Thanks again for listening to The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.theagilebrand.show. To get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, visit my website at gregkihlstrom.com. Until next week, stay agile.